Good afternoon, everyone. Hearing Ben speak, I'm reminded that this is the work of many hands between public bodies, community groups, academics even, and wider communities as well. So I hope to sort of flesh out one aspect of that that's come through my research over the last 3 years. It's good to see some familiar faces here, including some very familiar ones, such as my mom and dad, who are joining us all the way from Vermont in the United States. But as was said there, I'm in the final year of my PhD with the University of the Highlands and Islands. It's entitled People, Place and the North Coast 500, a collaborative engagement with the contested landscapes of tourism. I live in Thurso, and I've spent most of the last 3 years working with local heritage groups on community-generated photography projects that reflect on the relationship between heritage and tourism around the North Highlands. So this afternoon, I'm hoping to provide some insights from my research and share some reflections that hopefully will be of interest and use to you, whether you're directly involved in tourism or heritage organizations, or simply if these are themes which affect or intrigue you in your own daily life. So this photograph was taken in October 2020 by a participant in one of these projects. It was taken by the shore of Dunnet Bay, located here in Caithness, in the far north of Scotland, and it tells the story of one of many contested landscapes of tourism around the NC500. As most of you will know, the NC500 was launched in 2016, and it has been a wildly popular place marketing initiative that invites visitors to undertake a 516-mile-long scenic touring circuit around the northernmost section of the Scottish Highlands. And this flat, grassy spot overlooking the bay was a favourite haunt of tourists and camper vans who parked up overnight as they travelled along the NC500. In fact, for several years it was listed on social media and online caravanning communities as an ideal place to park overnight for free. After persistent problems with discarded litter, untended campfires and broken glass, the landowner dug a deep and wide trench to block access to this spot. Several days later, someone else came along and filled the newly dug trench in with stones so that camper vans and cars could once again drive up to the parking place. This sort of back and forth of shovels and stones can be seen in the foreground of the photograph. And if you were to go there today, you would see that the issue has been settled once and for all with the insertion of massive boulders which permanently block access. The participant who took this photograph is a local resident. She knew several of the people involved, and she witnessed the entire saga over the course of several months as she went on her daily walk along the shore here. Her perspective allows us to understand how tourism works its way into local people's landscapes and into their lives. To my eyes, this image and the process of making it is a powerful example of a new way of doing contemporary archaeology. So the image and the story related here were made in the context of one of 3 community photography projects that have formed the centerpiece of my PhD research. Participants have used disposable film cameras to create public-facing exhibitions that make visible a community-generated record of place. Inspired by other forms of socially engaged academic research, these projects are intended to spark productive conversations around tourism and community heritage here in the North Highlands. What do local people feel is missing from the narratives told about their places to tourists? What issues are alive to them, and given the opportunity, what would they choose to share with visitors about the place where they live? Now, as you'll know, the conversation around tourism in the North Highlands has become heated and very partisan, particularly concerning the North Coast 500, which is understandable given its widespread impact, as Ben touched upon in the previous presentation. That's impact both positive and negative. It's deeply related to deeply rooted issues, underinvestment in infrastructure, economic over-reliance on tourism, and the question of how the people and places of the Highlands are represented in culture and media. So against this backdrop, rather than taking a partisan pro or anti-NC500 position amid the tourism debate, the community-generated perspectives made in these projects are aimed more at encouraging dialogue, more of an invitation rather than an accusation, if you will. And by invitation, I mean an invitation into local people's lives and memories and their day-to-day realities, which, rather than being an afterthought, should be placed right at the heart of how tourists interact with and understand their host communities. So in May 2019, a few dozen people involved in community heritage around the North Highlands came to a launch event for my PhD held at the Centre for History in Dorna. Relationships and insights gained from that encounter became the foundation of my PhD, really. From the outset, I knew that my PhD would focus on the role of heritage in tourism. After all, again, as Ben outlined, heritage undeniably serves an economic purpose as a central feature of place marketing to potential visitors and a huge draw. And yet, at the same time, it's also a social and cultural resource for local people, a source of community cohesion and local identity, and a way to build a narrative of place that's generated from the inside and projected outwards. These multiple uses of heritage, which are sometimes intertwined and sometimes in tension with one another, makes heritage an important lens through which to learn about and influence the relationship between tourism and local communities. By reaching out to community heritage organizations around the route of the NC500, I wanted to hear firsthand about the issues and opportunities facing them. Their input would shape my thinking both about the complex impacts of tourism and also about the methods that I would end up using as part of my research. And this launch event also planted the seeds of the wonderfully collaborative partnerships that are bearing fruit today. Folk from the 3 case study locations in which my research is based were all present at that launch event. On the map here, superimposed over the route of the North Coast 500, you can see the location of my 3 case studies. The first is with the Castle Hill Heritage Centre in Castletown, Caithness, just a few miles away from where I'm sitting now. The second with the Seaboard Centre in the seaboard villages of East Ross. And the third ongoing collaborative case study is with several local bodies in Assynt on the west coast. The projects which I implemented in each of these case studies were inspired by a research method called photo voice, in which groups of participants take photographs and undertake group discussions to generate collective insights and solutions to socially relevant problems. The method was first used to highlight under-recognized issues in women's health services in rural China and has since been used in a wide range of contexts, from community activism to policymaking to community arts. I was drawn to the visual element of this method because by placing the image-making power in participants' own hands, it downplays the sort of traditional idea of an academic expert and emphasizes shared control over the production of knowledge. And then in the context of tourism, people-generated images of place might shake up some of the stereotyped images of highland landscapes that are sold to tourists, romanticized landscapes of myth, backwardness, and isolation. So each participant in the project received a 37-shot disposable film camera, which they used to chronicle their own relationship with the landscapes around them as they went about their daily routines over the course of roughly a month. Once the shots were developed and printed, we shared the photos with each other and discussed and debated the stories and meanings behind them. Finally, for the exhibition you see here, the participants wrote thoughtful descriptive captions for their selection of photos that they wish to share with the public. I'm tremendously grateful for these really perceptive and often beautiful contributions to my research, and also for the friendships that these participants have given me over the last couple of years. So I'll turn now to a selection of pictures that participants in these projects have taken, and I'll use them to talk about some of the observations and reflections that this research has prompted for me. I see there's some conversation in the chat about trouble seeing the images. Is it working for people now? Yeah. Good. I'm glad to hear it because the pictures sort of matter in this instance. On the left here is a screenshot of the About page on the North Coast 500 website. And I want to draw your attention to a sentence partway down, which reads, "The North Highlands has become one of the most iconic destinations in Scotland because of the NC500. Why not take the road that never was, that suddenly appeared as if by magic? But from the perspective of the people who live in the North Highlands, there is a radically different concept of place. The road didn't appear suddenly for the benefit of tourists, and neither did the communities that live along it. One of these perspectives is constructed for the benefit of those on the outside looking in, while the other is rooted in inhabitation, in the rhythms of home, in relationships with family and friends, in cultural meanings and stories, and ultimately in the sort of contemporary social and economic issues that people who live here encounter. So I wanted to see how these two perspectives could be placed in closer dialogue with one another. Meanwhile, I thought the photo on the right, taken by a participant in the Castletown research project, was a really fascinating way of juxtaposing the touristed and inhabited ways of seeing. In the caption which she prepared for public display, the participant wrote, "Tucked away behind the main street lives Kevin McPhee, the lobster fisherman. In the winter, his large lobster boat is moved here from the harbour by crane. I love to see the creels piled up in his garden next to a refrigerated cabin, which hums away, keeping the lobsters cool until collected. It fell silent during the lockdown in the early days of the pandemic. Most of the catch is exported to the restaurants of Spain and France." So rather than photographing a fishing boat out in the bay, which is a touristic trope we've probably all seen and possibly even participated in through our own practice of photography, the participant here is showing us the backstage version of that same scene. The boat is out of the water, it's tucked away on a side street in the village, along with laundry hung to dry, and the vital, unromantic equipment that keeps it going. In her caption, she roots the image in the practical considerations of earning a living and negotiating the shifting tides of international trade. The fishing boat is contextualized in a particular person's material and economic reality, rather than functioning as pure symbol in the impersonal touristic narrative of place. So by centering the experience and perspectives of inhabitants, I've sought to acknowledge participants' own sort of self-conscious agency in the complex encounter with tourism. These projects have provided a space for participants to subvert and give context to, and ultimately, I think, enrich the established touristic visual narrative. This photograph might be of particular interest to those of an archaeological persuasion amongst us. The object of a type which some of you may recognize is a quern, used for grinding meal or mashing turnips or so on. And it sits in the driveway of a 3-generation family of farmers who participated in the Seaboard Photography Project. And the story behind it is a fascinating example of the profound and living historical consciousness that's all around us here in the Highlands and Islands. So this quern began its life in the Clachan of Can, in the Kyle of Sutherland, a mile northwest of Helmsdale. When the participants' ancestors were evicted from Can in the early 19th century by the Duke of Sutherland, they brought this quern with them by boat on their post-clearance journey 30 miles south by sea to Hilton of Cadboll, where a community largely formed of the recently dispossessed was springing up along the shoreline. To give you a sense of what effort would have been involved in moving this, it broke 2 wheelbarrows while shifting it from the bottom of the hill to the house where it currently sits. And I find that an object like this tells an incredible story linking the past to the present. And yet these stories aren't necessarily obvious to those who visit the area. Sharing them in this fashion sheds light on links across space and time to historical processes which continue to shape people's identities and sense of place today. It's a really powerful method of storytelling. This picture, also from the seaboard villages, shows a spot called the Channel along the shore, there in the seaboard where I conducted my second case study. It's known only to children and those who once were children there. And in the group session at the end of this project cycle, in which the participants shared and discussed some of the photos they'd taken with each other, this picture prompted a cascade of memories and associations. The 8 participants, all but one of whom had grown up in the villages, remembered how the channel was the social hub of childhood on the seaboard. Leaping from one side of the channel to the other, younger children at one spot, older ones crossing a much more wide and fearsome gap, was something of a rite of passage. Participants recalled the feeling of fear and then triumph before and after taking the leap, the emergent hierarchies of courage and maturity, and occasional soakings. A scene like this doesn't fit into straightforward conceptions of what constitutes heritage. However, I think the participants' decision to share this place with me and with the public indicates that it's deeply interwoven in the many layers of memory and meaning in which local people's experience of place is enmeshed. We as academics, heritage or archaeology practitioners, or even as tourism practitioners might even benefit from looking more carefully at spaces like this. From my perspective as a researcher, the methodology used here gave me plenty of opportunity to engage with this, and I would hope that sharing this with tourists could be similarly productive. So alongside illuminating some of the tensions resulting from tourism, as in the case of the trench dug at the illicit overnight parking spot, the personal relationships with landscape explored in this project also open space for the sharing of more joyful and perhaps unexpected dimensions of place. And I think this carries the possibility of fostering really open-hearted dialogue between and among local people and visitors. What questions might this raise for tourists about the places they're visiting and the places they've come from? Where are similar spaces of meaning, ones which might not feature in any formal narratives of place in their own lives? So I'm seeing that time is getting by, so I'm going to conclude with some final reflections on the relationship between heritage and tourism as seen from my perspective as a researcher. So the first of these reflects some of the tensions that have arisen recently around tourism. It's nothing new, but it's maybe become more pronounced in recent years. We need to shift away from place narratives which eclipse local people, both from the process of forging those narratives and from the images themselves. Hopefully this can engender a more sympathetic and mutually beneficial form of tourism. There are many, many different groups working on this front, as Ben touched upon, and I hope that my research contributes in some small way to this effort. Second, how can we as individuals and organizations who are involved in heritage and archaeology reach out and encompass the new spaces and themes of social and cultural meaning which are being generated today? What is the heritage of now that we will leave for future generations? This will be familiar to anyone involved in contemporary or future-looking archaeology, and it's important that this heritage of now touch on the personal and the everyday, as these pictures show. Then the last 2 points are interlinked. It's important to me that my work be meaningful and productive, not just for myself as a researcher, but also the people and organizations that I'm working with. The University of the Highlands and Islands has a strong reputation for socially engaged and collaborative academic practice, and that's a significant part of what drew me here. I've been well supported by my supervisors in developing methodologies that maybe avoid the traditional power dynamic in academic research where an outside expert extracts valuable information from passive subjects. Participants and collaborative partners in my research have pushed me in unexpected directions, raising themes of gender and age, cultural memory, and social change that I couldn't necessarily have anticipated when I began this PhD. And then, from my perspective, the most gratifying aspect of it all has been the joyfulness and inventiveness with which participants have responded to the prompts raised by these projects. So many wonderful conversations have unspooled from these images, and I hope that this presentation encourages you to think differently about the relationship between tourism and heritage, and also about how that relationship might look in your own life. So, thank you.